Frank came before us today and showed us what has happened in the Gulf. It is very interesting. And why the cap failed that they first started. And why the wells that are being drilled to intersect this well, the relief wells, should be successful. And, you know, if you want an expert, if you want to know how you do something, you ought to talk to somebody that's actually done it. And Trent, a member of this body, has actually done it. So we'll find out whenever we get this spill stopped, we'll find out what happened in the Gulf to cause this thing to blow out. And it may be human error. It may be the company's error. It may be shortcuts they took. It may be the inspector's error. It could be just about anybody's error. We don't know. Now, the truth is, we don't have to know yet because the presumption is overwhelming that it's BP's responsibility, and they admit it. It's their responsibility. But blame gaming is not going to stop the oil from flowing into the Gulf. Putting our resources together at every level, from every source, is part of what you do when you have a national emergency. And I don't care whether that national emergency has a name Katrina or Rita or Ike or any of the other names, or Carla, or any of other the names of hurricanes that have swept across our Gulf and attacked almost all Gulf states at some point in time. Or it has the name, what's the name of this well? I can't even remember anymore. Anyway, just call it the BP well in the Gulf of Mexico that blew out. Blame game is not solving the problem. What's the problem? When it's a hurricane, the wind's blowing, and things are getting torn down, and we need to put our resources together to help the people and the industries that are attacked by that hurricane. Today we have animals, we have sea life, we have wildlife, sea life, human life that is threatened by this BP oil spill. And our first job, and the job not only of British Petroleum, but of those of us who have the responsibility of protecting this country, which would be the President of the United States, the Executive Department, this Congress, and everybody involved, should have immediately poured massive support into doing something about this oil well and stopping this spill. And we should have done it through the people who have the intelligence and the technology to tell us just exactly what we're dealing with. I wouldn't recommend you call a great white hunter in Africa to tell him how to put down this oil spill. I wouldn't recommend that you call a surgeon in Brooklyn, New York, and ask him to put down this oil spill. And I wouldn't recommend you talk to a community organizer and ask him how to put down this oil spill. I would recommend that you immediately, when this happened, approach those people who have the expertise to deal with this oil spill and do it. And quite honestly, I think we have to say that the President of the United States told us the buck stops with him, so he's the person who should have started this ball rolling when this whole thing started coming down on us. We've got a little chart up here, the Gulf spill timeline. And we're going to look at that for just a minute to see how well we did in deciding that we were, as a government, going to join the oil and gas industry in coming up with a solution to British Petroleum's disaster that they have created in our blessed Gulf of Mexico. In fact, I think I have the state with the largest amount of Gulf of Mexico coastline of any state in this union. And it would be close, Florida would be close second, and they may have more. I don't know. But certainly the state of Texas has a lot. So let's look at this thing for just a second. April the 20th, 2010, and today is the 16th day of June. So looking back to April the 20th, the explosion occurred, 11 people were killed. Right there, we knew we had a problem. The first oil leak was officially recognized and revealed by the administration in Washington on the April 24th. So 4 days later, the administration acknowledged and revealed to us that there was an oil leak. On April the 28th, the Secretary of the Interior, Mr. Salazar, traveled down to the BP Command Center in Houston. April the 29th, the Homeland Security Secretary Napolitano announced a spill of national significance, and President Obama made his first public remarks about the disaster. That's 9 days after it occurred. April the 30th, the President deployed his senior administration officials to the Gulf region to make requests of the Louisiana, and makes a request for remarks about what's going on, and the Louisiana National Guard was activated to assist. That's a start. That's a first start. President visits the Gulf on May the 2nd. Looks like 13 days later, after the event. Cabinet officers and members of Congress briefed the members of Congress on May the 4th about the seriousness of this event. May the 11th, Louisiana requests emergency permission from the federal government to dredge barriers to construct berms. Now, when I was about 18 years old, I worked in South Louisiana, and the whole ecology and economy of Louisiana is directly affected by what they call the marshlands. There are literally thousands of people who make their living because the marshlands in Louisiana thrive to be breeding grounds and producing grounds for numerous amounts of seafood products. And in fact, I would venture to say that there's not anybody who eats seafood in the United States and have done it for any length of time and all in their life has eaten seafood that was produced as a result of the overall environment of the Louisiana coastal region, which is 99% marsh. Now, the marsh is different from the beach. The beach is bad. If you got a beautiful beach like they have at Pensacola, that gorgeous white sand, or anywhere in Alabama or Mississippi or anywhere in Florida, tar balls on the beach, and this nasty sludge coming in the beach is going to be icky and yucky and nasty, and if you get it all over your feet, you have to clean it off with alcohol. It can burn you, it can tear you up. But if that stuff comes into the marsh, it can kill and will kill plant life, animal life, and ocean life. So when the governor of Louisiana, who was so unfairly criticized here tonight by the opposition, when the governor said, look, guys, at least authorize some dredging to put some sand barriers between us and between our marsh and that terrible spill that's headed our direction. And yet it wasn't until the 27th of May that the federal government, granted Louisiana a partial permission to dredge sand up to build a sort of a island-type barrier, so maybe that oil would hit the sand and not come in where all the plants and the wildlife and the sea life lives and thrives and functions. But that was only 27 days too late. On the 28th of May, the president went down and looked at the Gulf state, his second visit to the Gulf states, and this is where he told us, the buck stops with me. And I agree with him. The buck stops with the President of the United States. And when now we are hearing people scream about a national disaster, which it is, and the President of the United States' job was to lead And lead means go out, and if you have to, roll up your sleeves and suck oil out of the water. But you certainly need to get people out there that are taking it seriously enough to follow the instructions of the man on the ground, Governor Jindal, who said it's not a solution, but it sure would help if there's a barrier between us and that oil. And he shouldn't have had to wait for the federal government to hem and haw and say, well, we don't know what that sand island you're going to build is going to do to the overall environment of South Louisiana. What does it matter? The oil is going to come in there and wreck it. So let's just dig up the sand. But no, we had to delay. On the 29th of May, British Petroleum did its top kill plan to try to stop the oil, and it failed. The 2nd of June, the Obama administration finally approved Louisiana's plan to dredge and tells BP to pay $360 million for 5 new berms. The Justice Department announces a criminal investigation into the explosion and the spill. That's all of May and 11 days in April when nothing of significance took place. June the 14th, the Senate Democrats write BP calling on the company to set up a $20 billion independent administrative escrow fund to compensate victims of the spill. June the 15th, that was yesterday, President Obama makes the Oval Office speech on the oil spill and uses the crisis to push climate change legislation. And if you heard what our colleagues were talking about in the previous 1 hour before this Congress, they were talking about that we need to have these alternative fuels to replace oil and replace petroleum products. In fact, all carbon products, coal, oil, natural gas. And they talk to you about the subsidies and other things. But they show you on the chart, and you see this one right here, it's algae. And algae is going to be, we're going to replace, that next year we're going to replace all the energy produced by oil with algae. If you'll put the resource in algae. No, because it won't. Did you say, look at these wind farms. This is going to replace all the energy we need to charge our electric cars so we don't even have to run on any kind of petroleum product. And that's all we need is to subsidize that and pour money into it, and it'll replace it in the next 2 years. Now, why am I using the term the next 2 years? Because the President of the United States has put a moratorium on the Gulf, on drilling in the Gulf, and 17% of our consumption in oil and oil products, which includes plastic and other byproducts of oil and natural gas, all of those, 17% of that a year comes from the deep water drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. So in 2 years, that's 34% of our fuel consumption nationwide that's going to have to be accounted for by somebody in some alternative form if we're going to give up on oil and gas. Are there any of our alternatives that are even close to replacing 34% of our energy consumption in this country? No. Will there be? Maybe. But the reality is, we get up in the morning and we start our cars and we drive to work, and generally we're burning gasoline or diesel, all of which are products of the petroleum industry. And if you're not going to use gasoline or diesel, then you better hook a sail up to your car and hope the wind is blowing towards work, or you're not going to work. So the reality is, to just cave in on an industry because of a terrible disaster is like saying, oh my God, a 747 went down with 600 passengers, shut down the air industry for the next 6 months. But here's the reality. The reality is this 6-month shutdown of the Gulf is actually going to be a 5-year shutdown of the Gulf, because once they pull those rigs out of the Gulf, we're not going to get them back, it's estimated, for 3 to 5 years. So the 6-month moratorium in effect shuts down 17% of our energy production in this country for 5 years, potentially for 5 years. It's time to be realistic and say, what's the big problem right now? And it's the oil spill. What's the problem? Why is it a problem? Because oil is floating around on our pristine Gulf of Mexico. It is moving from state to state. It's eventually going to come ashore in some place. And why aren't we doing everything we can to bring people over here from anywhere that'll help and say, we'll help? I'm going to stop. I'm going to add one more thing. On June 16th, President Obama met with BP executives in the White House. That's today. And he got his $20 billion to go into escrow. But the reality is, where have we been? Where has our leadership been of this country, the President of the United States and the administration, when the oil was spilling out of that well? Why didn't we answer the phone when the Dutch said, 3 days after the spill started, we've got a fleet of skimmers that will come over and help you skim oil? Why didn't we respond? In fact, why didn't we say, world, we help you every chance you ask us to help you. Give us a hand. Anybody who's got resources that can soak up oil, please bring them to the United States and help us out. And that kind of leadership had to come from the President of the United States. And the waiving of the antique act called the Jones Act had to be done by the President of the United States. So as we talk about this disaster, let's start by saying, what's our real problem? And our real problem is it's leaking oil, and we got to clean it up. Before anything else, we got to clean it up. But instead, we act to attack the drilling industry and shut down 17% of our energy resources a year at a minimum, because it's very, very good and popular to attack the oil industry. But it's, in reality, tomorrow morning, when you crank up your engine, say to yourself, what kind of fuel is driving me to work today, and where did it come from? I am very pleased to see that I'm joined by two of my colleagues, and I'm going to call on Mr. Mica from Florida, yield him his whatever time he wishes to consume to talk about this very, very disastrous situation and a bill that he has that offers some solutions.
Well, thank you so
Chairman
much. Thank you. We affectionately refer the gentleman from Texas as Judge Carter, but distinguished member of Congress, part of the leadership of the Republican team. And thank you also for coming tonight before the Congress and the American people, the House of Representatives, to review probably what is one of the worst ecological disasters, natural disasters our country has ever experienced, and actually to come here and review some of the timeline of what has taken place. You've touched on a number of important issues. First of all, as someone who comes from the state of Florida, we're part of the Gulf Coast. I have to extend our deepest heartfelt sympathies to those that lost lives, both on the rig, and now we heard today from some of our colleagues in an extensive review that we participated on our side of the aisle from some of those from the adjoining states, how their economy is suffering, and how the proposed moratorium that's being arbitrarily imposed may make this disaster even worse. It's hard to imagine it being worse, but again, we empathize with those who've lost life, who've been injured, and now have seen their livelihood dramatically impaired by this natural disaster. What we've got to do, though, is we've got to step back, we've got to look at what took place, and then we've got to look at some remedial action. Judge Carter, gentleman from Texas, raised some excellent points. This is now 60 days, almost 2 full months into this disaster since it took place on April 20th. We have not had the proper response. That's evident. The gentleman talked about the need to bring skimmers and other craft in. He spoke about waiving the Jones Act, which President Bush did, I think, in 4 days afterwards. We haven't really called for a waiving of the Jones Act, but we would support it. It probably should have been done. There have been offers of foreign vessels. I was absolutely dumbfounded. On Saturday, I received an urgent email from those who are involved in with American flag vessels, one of the leading maritime and ship owners, domestically flagged, U.S. flag, who contacted me on Saturday. The message just floored me. Mr. Mica, our industry, the American flagged industry, doesn't mind waiving the Jones Act. The Jones Act does protect American jobs and American labor. Again, it's great to have those flagged vessels. Waiving it is done on rare occasions and emergencies, as President Bush did. But I was informed that we have flagged Jones Act compliant vessels, American flag vessels, waiting. This particular company, one of the largest maritime companies in the United States, American flag, has been waiting for a call. They've been waiting for a call from the Department of Homeland Security, from the Coast Guard, any federal agency or BP to come in and provide. They have vessels that can help and could be helping in the cleanup even before we exempted foreign vessels to come in on this, and we've had an offer of that for some time. So I was shocked. I sent to Secretary Napolitano yesterday a letter, and I outlined what the information I got. I lead the Transportation Committee in the House on the Republican side. But I said, Madam Secretary, this is unbelievable that no one has even availed themselves to the American flag vessels who are ready, who have equipment. We should not be endangered in Florida or in other states in having that oil up on our shores. We have the capability that has not even been utilized to date. So this was my letter, my plea to the Secretary, and I'm shocked and disappointed. The other thing too is there seems to be a conflict. Last night we heard the President say that we have been in charge. He's in charge as the Commander-in-Chief under the Oil Spill Recovery Act that we passed in 1990 after Exxon Valdez. It's pretty clear the chain of command. But Thad Allen, who is in charge of this, former Coast Guard Commandant, now in charge of the spill cleanup, he said, but we do not have the capability. The United States government does not have the capability. He said that over and over again, that the private sector has this capability. Here, again, we have U.S. flag vessels that can do the cleanup, haven't gotten a call, still waiting. The Jones Act, they could have waived and allowed those who volunteered assistance with skimmers and other equipment that has not come in. So while there are folks in this administration who say they're in charge, there's some disconnect here in getting the equipment, getting the resources out there. In fact, the private sector has been in charge, and this is the first time the President has met with these folks. I was dumbfounded too today, and I think Judge Carter was in that meeting and other members on our side of the aisle, when we heard the Gulf Coast delegation say they have requested but not yet met with the President of the United States. It's hard to believe the President would not meet with the elected representatives of the Gulf Coast states to sit down. And then time and again we heard in the review that took place today of requests, simple requests for berms to stop the oil coming into the marshes, simple requests to act now before or sooner rather than later, and we've seen the results of now that oil's making its way towards the Florida shores and doing even more damage. So if, in fact, the President is in charge, we need to free these vessels, employ every means possible to keep this disaster from going further. One other thing I disagree with in the President, now I know it's important to act, and he did act in imposing a moratorium, but I think what they've got to do, and I believe he revised that moratorium to not affect the 3,500 shallow water drilling sites, but it is closing down the deep water drilling sites. And some of those are exploration sites, and in fact they probably should be closed until we have assurances that future deep water drilling can be done. My point here is that by closing all of them down with a blanket moratorium, we are putting more people out of work, taking a horrible situation and making it worse. We will have even more people unemployed. So I think the logical, reasonable approach would be to send inspectors in, hire or retain whatever we need, or if we have government officials to go in and see that the deep water drilling that is taking place where they actually have the well in production, which I think is about half of the approximately 30 deep water wells that are out there. We don't want to make this situation worse economically for those that have lost their job, seeing their business closed down, or again see thousands of people put out of work by the wrong approach. So a reasonable approach. First, we get every piece of equipment, whether it's U.S. or foreign flag, there. Let's get this. This can be cleaned up. This is a doable job with both U.S. vessels that have been waiting to hear that call from the administration. And then secondly, let's also be reasonable in the moratorium. I have been a strong advocate of keeping the U.S. independent and free as much as we could, drill where it's safe. My state of Florida, I helped on a 100-mile set off years and years ago. I thought that was reasonable. But you know, it always may or may not make a difference, because this was only 45 miles off the coast of Louisiana, as we've seen. The other thing we need to do is have a good backup system. We shouldn't be rubber stamping approvals that any company, whether it's BP or anyone else. BP in February of 2009 gave this, and this is a copy of it. This is the plan for their exploring that site, and they're doing an exploration well, a development well. This plan was submitted in March of 2009, over a year ago, and this is the one-page approval. I got a copy of this before our Transportation Committee hearing subject, just before it took place. This is the one-page carte blanche approval. I don't think some of the people in the Minerals Management Service even read this 59-page request, and we've heard hearings lately as to the failures of BP to outline a good, solid proposal. This proposal is the basic plan for drilling that BP submitted, and it also refers to a much bigger document, and that's the actual 500-plus page document that details all of the spill cleanup procedures that BP would employ. That was also rubber stamped with this approval, this one-page approval. So this was done by the Obama administration with people sleeping at the switch or not paying attention. what's shocking, and I heard former Governor Palin tell the country this, and people should listen to Governor Palin on this. Sarah Palin, when she was the governor, she was tough on the oil companies. No one passed anything by her. She cracked down on them, made sure they towed the line. And what was interesting is Governor Palin told what they did is, she said that this never would have happened, this kind of approval in her state, because there would have been more scrutiny. The plan that BP offered, in addition to this 59-page, the 500 cleanup plan, it looks like BP merely mirrored the Alaska plan. In fact, it told how they were going to deal with cleaning up Walter's seal and polar bears, none of which I've seen in the Gulf of Mexico. So again, the Minerals Management Service was asleep at the switch. What's finally startling is two things. Is one, I had our Transportation Infrastructure Committee get a copy of the President's budget. This is the Obama budget, not doctored anything. I have the exact pages and cover copied of the budget. And in February of this year, before this oil spill, the President submitted a budget to our T&I Committee, Transportation and Infrastructure, that oversees the Coast Guard, to slash the Coast Guard, our first responders, by 1,100 positions. In addition, he wanted to decommission and take out of service ships, helicopters, aircraft, all which are necessary for our first response. I remember when Frank Lubiando, who's my ranking member on the Coast Guard Committee within our Transportation Committee, when we heard about this, we sent out this press release. This is in February, after the President had recommended cutting our first responders. We said it's outrageous, but we said this is a recipe for disaster. And this is dated February 25th, after we got this. Then startling in this also, if you look a little bit further in the budget, not under our purview, but our staff found this, that the Minerals Management Service that the President talked about last night and how we need to clean that up and everything, in his budget that he proposed to Congress, he proposed slashing the environmental review agency within that, or activities within that agency and bureau, by $2 million. A pretty dramatic cut for someone who has to review, again, what the private sector submits, their plan, slashing that plan. I thought this was just unbelievable. And finally, this is in February. In March, the President came out, and this is the story in the New York Times, and said that we have to increase drilling in the Gulf. This is it. This didn't make it up. It's the New York Times. Obama opened offshore areas to oil drilling, and it says right here, the Gulf. So first he's slashing first responders. Then he's next proposing slashing the agency that does the environmental reviews. The review, again, the oil companies present that to the Mineral Management Service. They review it. I showed you the rubber stamp April 6th that they approved it. And then finally, again, the main thing now is cleaning this mess up. And we've got to employ everyone we can, every piece of equipment, be it domestic or foreign, keep that from coming in. This is a doable job. When governors ask to take steps, it doesn't need, the solution doesn't need to be caught up for weeks in approvals and agencies. It shouldn't be why we can't do something. It should be, how can we get this accomplished? We've got people around the coast whose livelihood now depends on this. We can't let this disaster that's already done great damage to our economy. We have an incredible loss of life that we've seen, and again, we empathize with those who have lost loved ones in this tragedy, but we can't make a horrible tragedy even worse. So reasonableness on this approach. So I thank Judge Carter, my colleague, gentleman from Texas, I see, We also have another outstanding member of our Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Mr. Olsen, also a gentleman from Texas. I thank you for coming out tonight, sharing with the Congress, the House of Representatives, and our colleagues some of the facts and information that needs to get out to the public so that we can get this mess behind us. Thank you so much, and I'll yield back.
About your Oil Spill Liability Fund Improvement Act that you've proposed.
Well, I'll tell you right
before you yield back, would you tell us a little bit about
right now? We're open to suggestions. We are looking at trying to be reasonable in whatever we do. To just impose unlimited caps on liability could be a very serious and damaging measure. First of all, let me say I believe that BP must be held accountable, fully accountable, and certainly that company has the resources. They must be responsible for the cleanup. They must also be, even though there's a limit under the current 1990 statutes of $75 million, they must be held accountable far beyond that for economic damages. What we don't want to see is that we make the terms for liability so high that only a few multinational corporations will ever be in the oil business. Small producers in Texas, throughout the Gulf, there are thousands of people in business that do a good job day in and day out. 3,500 of 3,600, I believe, active rigs in the Gulf are shallow water, but they shouldn't be penalized by the failure of government, by the failure of a big corporation. Let's hold their feet to the fire. So we're going to work with the Democrats. We're going to work with the administration. We're going to try to craft something that is fair and reasonable, holds people accountable, holds their feet to the fire. The current fund that we have should not be just a slush fund or front financing the cleanup for BP or any big company. That was actually set up for orphan spills or for a company that may not have the assets that was responsible for a spill. But we want that fund to continue to work. We may need to put more funds in it to make certain that we have coverage for the future. What we don't want to do, again, whether it's by the moratorium or by putting in insurance and liability limits that are so high that very few people can meet those requirements. So we're crafting that legislation. We want to do it in a bipartisan manner. The law does need to be altered. We should learn and we should benefit by this horrible experience and make it better and make certain that it doesn't happen again. Thank you for, again, your leadership and for asking me to participate tonight.
Before you yield back, would you tell us a little bit about, and I thank the gentleman for what he has had to say, and I want to tell you that my wife is Dutch, so I took a little offense at the fact that we had an offer of help from the Dutch of a fleet of skimmers, and it's my understanding we gave no response. Maybe that's different. I don't know. All I know is what I'm doing. I'm like Will Rogers. All I know is what I read in the newspapers. But
might I add
now I'm even more upset when I find out we have American flag ships waiting in the harbor ready to help, and nobody's asked for their help. We ought to be, the leadership that runs this country, the executive branch of the government, ought to be ashamed of themselves.
Now let me, if I might, if you'd yield just a
I
second.
yield back.
In conclusion, I do want to say that I worked very closely with Mr. Oberstar, the Democrat chair of the T&I committee. When we found out that the $1.6 billion fund has a $150 million cap for emergency use, we came together last week. I offered legislation specifically to deal with that. Again, we have to act in a responsible manner for the country. We passed that. The House concurred with us. And we have provided some temporary relief. Again, I'm not going to let the $1.6 billion or the $150 million be a piggy bank for BP or any responsible parties. But we want to make certain that all the resources that are there on an emergency basis to the administration, to the Coast Guard, whoever. So no one can say it was that Congress didn't act in a timely fashion. We were alerted some of the funds were running low in that emergency portion of the 1.6, which is put out in advance. So that's, I talked a little bit before about the legislation we're looking at on liability caps, and that's what we've done in a bipartisan fashion today. We did that, and we're prepared to do even more on the caps, whatever it takes, and whatever resources and assets of the government and the private sector we can bring to bear to bring this horrible disaster under control. Thank you again for your leadership, both of our Texas members, Mr. Carter and Mr. Olsen.
Reclaiming my time, let me say right off, I am very, very proud to be part of a Congress that instantly reacts to a crisis situation. You and Mr. Overstar should be commended for that reaction. That's what we're asking from the entire government to do. Let's react positively. Let's work as a team. Let's quit blaming previous administrations. Let's go do the job to clean this mess up. I thank you very much. My good friend from Texas, who lives in the heart of oil country USA, Houston, Texas is, in my way of thinking, the center of the universe for the oil industry. And my good friend Pete Olsen is one of our members of our Houston delegation, very knowledgeable in this area. He has some legislation, and there may be other things he wishes to talk about. So I yield to my friend Pete Olsen, the member from Sugar Land and All Points South, to talk to us about how he feels about what's going on today.
Well, thank you for hosting this special order tonight on such a critically important issue for the American people. I'd like to thank my colleague from Florida for coming by and giving his perspectives on how this disaster is affecting Florida. And I'm going to have a theme tonight, Judge. I was in the Navy for 10 years, naval officer. We're trained to lead. I mean, we're assigned in my aircraft. I was a crew of 12, 5 officers, 7 enlisted folks. I was the patrol plane commander. So those 11 individuals depended upon me to bring them, take them out, do the mission, and come back home safely. And to sum it up in 2 words, the philosophy is leaders lead. And guess what? We're not seeing leadership out of Washington. We've had a very difficult situation. We've had the largest oil spill in American history. And there are thousands of jobs affected by it already. The food processing industry, the fishing industry across the coasts of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. The tourist industry, the people, we're hitting the summer season. This is when people go on vacation. We're past Memorial Day. The hotels are about half full from what I hear. It's having a significant impact on the people of the Gulf Coast. But what does the administration do? Do they lead? No. In a knee-jerk reaction to this terrible tragedy again, they impose a 6-month moratorium on deep water drilling. All of it stopped. Again, disaster for our economy and for our nation. Let me go over some of the specifics with you, as I know my good friend knows. The jobs. The numbers I'm hearing are up to 150,000 jobs are going to be lost because of this moratorium. That's 1.5 times my hometown of Sugar Land, which the judge mentioned. That's like wiping Sugar Land and going down to Rosenberg or Richmond and taking them off the map. 150,000 jobs. The rigs that are currently out there, the 33 rigs, I've talked to a constituent in my district who has an ownership interest in 2 of those rigs and asked him last week, how long can you hang out? He said 3 weeks max. How much does it cost you? Well, the rigs are a little different. One's down around $500,000 a day, $500,000 a day. The other one's at $1 million a day. $1 million. This baby goes on, this moratorium goes on for 6 months. That is going to be $180 million that company is going to just have to absorb. And you know what they're going to do? Guess what? They're going. They're going overseas. He's been talked to. My constituent has been talked to from interest from Australia, from Brazil, from Western Africa, and from Eastern Africa already. And he's considering their options very seriously because he can't afford to be paying $500,000, $1 million per day as long as this moratorium goes on. It's going to have a devastating effect on our domestic production of energy. One of the great problems we have in America, and it's something we should have fixed years ago, is our dependence upon foreign oil. We all remember 1979 when the Shah fell and Iran was taken over by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Arab world cut off our fuel supply. I was a 16-year-old in Houston, Texas, just got my driver's license. So my job was to take the car up when it got down to about a quarter of a tank of gas, take it up, get in that gas line, depending on what the last number of your license plate was, odd or even on odd or even day. And I loved it, standing there with my radio, my window down. Now that I'm an adult, I realize what a disaster that was, and it's not gone. I mean, it's still out there today. As the judge knows, we've got serious challenges in the Middle East. I mean, the Mr. Khatami in Iran is scary. I mean, he's trying to get a nuclear weapon. He was here in our country a couple of weeks ago at the United States, at the UN, at the United Nations, sat down with George Stephanopoulos, and literally, this is the leader of Iran, told him that the Osama bin Laden is here in Washington, D.C. Let me say that again, Judge. I think Osama bin Laden is here in Washington, D.C. This guy is at the, he's got the finger on trying to get some nuclear weapons. He certainly has some oil, and he's got friends out there, the Saudis and others, who would cut him off if something happens. And what's happened, as you know too, judges, just as well, this administration has hurt our relationship with our great ally Israel. In 18 months, our relationship with Israel has gone from being one of our strongest allies to someone that the world looks at and goes, are the United States really with them? That's creating another dangerous situation where countries out there are going to start taking chances and taking shots at our best friend. And again, what happens at the end of the day if we stand up for Israel? Maybe we get another oil embargo down. We can't afford that. And yet this administration's actions by imposing this 6-month moratorium on deep water drilling in the Gulf is going to help that cause. I don't know where to start sometimes. What we're doing here, as my colleagues mentioned, is we introduced a bill yesterday. Very simple bill, 1 page, half a page. Basically says, let's end the moratorium, Mr. President. We had a meeting today with Mr. Salazar. The Secretary of the Interior came over today. One question I asked him, I really wanted to get his, I asked him, do you believe that you were given all the accurate analysis on the economic impact of this moratorium on deep water drilling, so that when you made the decision, and he stands up and says it was his decision, that you knew all the facts. You knew that 150,000 Americans were going to lose their jobs, that those rigs in the Gulf were most likely going to go overseas, start developing oil in foreign nations, and they're not coming back anytime soon. It's a minimum, from what I've heard from people in my district, of 5 years before those rigs will even consider coming back, because they have paid all that money to go over there. They're going to sit there, they're going to make money, they're going to, again, decrease our national reserves here in America, increase our dependence on foreign oil. Again, Judge, leaders lead. What has the administration done? Well, as you talked about earlier, Governor Jindal asked for some sand, about 24 miles of sand to place in between some of the marshlands that were going to be impacted by the oil spill. Took our government 3 weeks to approve that. Why? Why, you ask? Well, we had to do some studies. The Environmental Protection Agency had to look and make sure that if we put that sand in front of the berms, we weren't going to do some things to hurt the berms and the wildlife behind that. You're going to hurt the wildlife behind that, and you're going to damage those berms if that oil gets in there. Put the sand up, prevent that from happening. Let's deal with that problem instead of going for the sure problem. Amazing. The Jones Act, you talked about that. We've got great allies out there who want to help us, who have come to us and said, please, we can help you. What did we do? No thanks. We've got this law that requires American unions, the CDR's unions, to man the ships. We don't need your help. Katrina, I guess that was 2005. President Bush, He was asked, to waive the Jones Act. He stepped up and did it. Why? Because it was right for America. He was focused on the problem, which was help Louisiana and New Orleans recover from that hurricane. The problem here is real simple, Judge. We've got oil spewed out of a hole in the Gulf of Mexico, about 5,000 foot deep. We need to focus on that. That's the problem, and the administration is not focused on that. Again, leaders lead. And what do we see out of the White House today? Coerced British Petroleum to a $20 billion slush fund, a privately funded slush fund for government to use and spend as they see fit. Now, BP has made some mistakes, and the investigation is not complete, but there's a lot of evidence and indications that they made some mistakes, cut some corners, and did things that weren't consistent with standard operating procedure. And they should pay for that, and they should reimburse the Americans who've been affected by that. But for the government to force upon them a $20 million concession that the government's going to handle and deal out as they see fit is just not what's in our country's interest. We've seen what this administration has done with we give them large amounts of money. First big vote I had as a member of Congress, almost $900 billion in economic stimulus package. Guess what? Has it stimulated the economy like the administration, like the president said it would? Has it kept our job rate below 8%, our unemployment rate? No, we're hovering about 10%. What do we spend it on? You know the answer to that, Judge. 2/3 of the money has been spent on public sector jobs, 1/3 on private sector jobs. I'd submit, and this isn't taking much of a chance, that's not how you grow an economy. And yet, the administration has now coerced British Petroleum to give them $20 billion to spend as they see fit. And finally, I've got the president's speech right here about the last third of it didn't have anything to do with the Gulf of Mexico. It had something to do with a much bigger agenda. He was talking about why this substantiated and justified the administration's pursuit of a hydrocarbon emission law, a carbon tax, cap and tax as we call it up here in the House. Again, why are we talking about this when we've got oil spilling out of the Gulf right now? And the answer is because the administration has an agenda that doesn't have anything to do with the oil coming out. It has everything to do with changing America, making us uncompetitive in a global market, increase our cost of energy for every American consumer, and getting a big tax increase with all these payments, these allotments that the corporations, companies, small business across America are going to have to pay. And it's quite frustrating. I go back home, Judge, I'm sure you get this. What's going on in D.C.? Who's leading? And the answer is nobody's leading right now. Again, leaders lead. And that's why I introduced that law that you mentioned earlier to just repeal the moratorium. Get the American people back working on those wells. The president, as you recall, met this past week with the families of the 11 rig workers that were killed in the explosion. And many of them, from the press reports, told him, please, Mr. President, don't do this moratorium. Don't do this to my husband, who most of these people were born and raised in small towns in Louisiana like Houma. And they planned on living their life there, raising their children there, raising their grandchildren there. And they see what's at stake here. They don't want a moratorium, even though their family members have made the ultimate sacrifice. And it's my hope that the administration listens to the American people, looks at the numbers, the 150,000 jobs that are going to be lost, just the fact that we're going to lose most of our domestic production, offshore production of oil, and we're going to take that overseas to foreign nations. And one other thing is the second largest income tax source for the federal government is offshore drilling, about $6 billion a year. Bye-bye. And it's just incredibly frustrating as a freshman member of Congress that we're going through this, Judge. We need to fight to make sure that this moratorium is repealed because it's in America's best interest. I yield back my time.
Reclaiming my time for a moment is an experienced offshore driller, as we all know. I said, Trent, what kind of salaries these guys make? He said the ordinary laborer, which in my day at least we used to call those guys roughnecks or roustabouts, $60 an hour. And the high-tech guys, the guys that can drive a drill bit down 5,000 feet under the water and another multi-thousands of feet and hit a 12-inch hole where this oil's coming out of, with that kind of skill, they're paid a lot more. Now, the question I would have for the administration, if you take the drilling away and all those people are looking for a job to replace that income, where is a guy who developed his skills through experience at the low-paid job on a well? So maybe he's got a high school education and he learned his job on the job. Where is he going to find $60 an hour to support his family on?
Well, the gentleman yield.
It doesn't exist. I yield. Then we got to go to Mr. Gomer.
Well, Judge, I think
I asked Trent Frank, who
the President gave us the answer to your question there. I mean, in his speech yesterday, and I quote, this is what he said: "I already have issued a 6-month moratorium on deepwater drilling. I know this creates difficulty for the people who work on these rigs, but for the sake of safety and for the sake of the entire region, we need to know the facts before we allow deepwater drilling to continue."
Reclaiming my time, we're also joined by my good friend, Mr. Gomer. I'm going to let him come on for about 4 minutes and have a little bit to say about this. Nothing?
I've got the last hour.
You got the last hour. All right. Well, maybe you'll be talking about some of this yourself. In wrapping this up, there's a lot of things that the Republicans, we get accused of an awful lot of things around here. We're going to ignore those accusations. Mr. Blunt has a bill, the Oil Spill Response and Assistance Act by Mr. Roy Blunt from Missouri. H.R. 5336 requires the Secretary of Energy to develop and deploy technology for the use in the event of breach or explosion at or at a significant discharge of oil from a deepwater port, offshore facility, or tank vessel, including caps, fireproof booms, remote-operated submersibles, 24-hour response time, double liability limits for oil companies. Mr. Blunt is addressing the issue. Mr. Schrock has an offshore safety response. That we have legislation. Let's do our job and let's continue. Let's end that moratorium and continue to drill and be safe.
The chair lays before the House the following enrolled bill.
H.R. 3951, an act to designate the facility